Time for a physics video. A Hythloday reply. Diffraction gradient. Yeah. Sort of interesting in terms of its effects. So I'll be playing with these films. That's interesting. Yes, you can see the light up there. But that is, they're very, yeah. They polarize in a lot of different ways. It's just kind of interesting that it's really the angle that the light comes in on that has so much to do with what it does. But anyway, I have different lines of resolution and whatnot, and very thin stuff, and a microscope to play with it. And I do plan on doing some experiments. So anyway, Hythloday, they just bring up experiments and financing that and all that kind of stuff, and he claims some willingness to do it, but he doesn't get enough views. And I would certainly argue that if you do some experimental videos, I mean, I'll do everything I can to support that effort in terms of shout-outs on the Amendum channel, the DraftScience channel, whatever I can do to drive traffic to experiments being done. I would think that would be quite worth doing. I certainly would love to be able to spend time doing experiments, but part of this problem is I don't have time. I mean, I have a lot of projects, and doing the two-slit experiment the way it should have been done by scientists a long time ago, over the last 100 years, that they didn't have time to do it, all the ways it should be done, is kind of irritating because, yeah, I'm really busy. And so, if I could buy time, that would be the real key. So, yeah, it's hard for me to say, okay, I'll invest in hardware, and then I won't have the time to really get the most out of it, and that I don't want to waste money. So I have wasted some in some stuff, and I should have enough mechanical equipment to do some experiments. But like I said, there's just so many things I want to do, and I don't have time in my days to do them, unfortunately. So lots of subjects, and I'm basically doing all this theoretical physics, and on top of that I'm supposed to do this time-consuming practical physics. That's really asking for a lot. So anyway, on this, I did want to point out he did a video, and the one previous to the one I'm responding to, and I left a little bit of a snarky criticism, because it was a horrible distortion of a Professor Lewin video where he was explaining the idea of Heisenberg, and using the fact that as you make an aperture smaller, you're limiting its locality, and therefore you're expanding its randomness in terms of its target vector, so to speak, where it's going to end up going. And that's the Heisenberg principle, in the sense that if you know one thing, you can't know the other, kind of bullshit. And again, if we could aim photons, this conversation would be over and everybody'd realize this is all a crock of shit. And I guess I would use an example, maybe instead of doing double slit experiments, I'll do double square experiments. Just cut up perfect squares. And obviously you can't do a double square experiment without 4 squares or something, so it gets a little complicated in terms of having it double in both directions. But I just mean is once you saw the single slit diffraction in one direction and the double slit diffraction in another direction, that would be the expectation. And I guess what I'm arguing is the two will interfere with each other. The surfaces, as you bring the two top surfaces down, they're going to change by my theory, they're going to change the space the photons are going through, and this will change the pattern resolved. And so if I'm right, there will be a difference in the pattern. I don't know how extreme the difference will be, but there will be a difference. And this might be why they don't do the double square experiment, is because there is an interference in the sense. Because what would it matter if there was a pattern going up and down and a pattern going left and right? Why are physicists somewhat afraid of that, photographing that, imaging that? Why is there no such thing as the double square experiment? Why is it this double slit? Why slits? I guess would be my argument. And I guess my argument is that when you change the matter, you will perhaps change the phenomenon in the double slit experiment. It probably wouldn't matter to the single slit, because that's sort of the Newton ring argument. It seems proportional to the aperture. But again, it's an interesting question that I don't think has been explored much, and so that would be worth doing the square versus the rectangle, because you would imagine that the field lines would be different in those two geometric configurations. So we'll see. I hope to. We'll see. Because again, time. This is one segment of my overall physics theory. This is only, in a sense, the double slit is just used as an example of how conventional physics there's reason for people to be deeply suspect of how they draw conclusions, how they jump to conclusions, how they jump to statements of proof and, undeniability. That's what this is used for, and that's the very thing you're diminishing as, oh yeah, they don't really mean to do that. So again, in this one he called it non-classical explanation of single slit light not due to Huygens principle. If you ask Professor Lewin if he intended to say in that video that he didn't think Huygens was real, you'd find out he'd be pretty pissed off that you just stated that he was claiming that single slit diffraction isn't caused by Huygens. This guy is a bit of a racist. I mean, he loves the Dutch, and he loves to point out every time a Dutch guy got something right. He loves Huygens because Huygens was Dutch, and it's just I would just say that if Professor Lewin could see what you did to that title, he'd be damn pissed off, because that wasn't what he was trying to say at all. He was just using the single slit in a general sense, just to use a description of the fact that the pattern spreads as the slit gets smaller. And obviously that would be an implication of the diffraction becoming greater. So it doesn't really demonstrate anything, but he certainly wasn't talking about the on-off pattern. He wasn't talking about the interference pattern not being caused by Huygens. So it's just a gross perversion of a 2-minute junk physics clip that he made regarding Heisenberg. Heisenberg has no mathematical relevance. It has no mathematical code. It has nothing to do with beyond just already establishing the idea of the wave mechanics itself. You don't need Heisenberg to do the math, and then the math is dependent on Huygens. So it's just kind of a fraud what you did with that video. And that's the very point I'm making, is that there's so much misinformation, so much perversion of experimental results, so much drawing way expansive conclusions based on a little grain of evidence. And you're just kind of diminishing that process as you contribute to the process, which is the irony. You're contributing to the very misinformation by perverting the use of a statement, by misquoting people. And then you claim that I've done that to Feynman when I'd say bullshit all the way down. I really don't have time to be going through Feynman's 6 hours of lectures to find the clip where he says, basically, we've thought about it and we can't find it, and well, maybe you can, in a very dismissive way. And again, I have played this Feynman clip of him debunking particle gravity with a trivial rain argument, as if raindrops are ultramundane particles. Anyway, so get to my notes. So yeah, I mean, I'm not opposed to becoming an experimental physicist, but I first want to do my theoretical physics and complete that work before I get lost in experiments. But I think it's there. I think the experiments are there to demonstrate that the assumptions that currently exist about what the causes are, that those assumptions are wrong, and it can be demonstrated that the effect is being caused by the matter, not by the photon. The photon isn't the thing with the magic powers. The matter is the thing with the complex field orientation, and it's the thing manipulating the photons. The photons aren't manipulating the space. The matter's manipulating the space. All right. Then he talked about the wave being sinusoidal, and in a sense, it's really not. And I think that's another thing that can be demonstrated through the physics. I think the cleaner two-slit experiment you do, the sharper the line between the on-off, the more digital it appears. So I think it really is an angular thing, and the only thing that leads to a blurring of the hard, precise angular diffraction is the fact that some scatter is being caused by whatever irregularities that are thrown into the experiment. To some extent, the fact that the origin is a 1 nanometer slit, let's say, a millimeter, not the 1,000 nanometers. So you have a millimeter opening, or a half a millimeter. But I think a millimeter will produce a pretty good single slit pattern. It's not a tiny opening; it's an opening, and what's built into that is the fact that there's the angles are going to be in a direction from all places, either this way or that way, you could argue, and that if it starts from the one end, it's going to be 1 millimeter difference at the source, and that 1 millimeter difference will add up to a lot of fudge by the time it gets to the screen. So I would say there's that millimeter of scatter, so to speak, sort of built into the pattern. Well, a half millimeter of scatter. Because I guess I would argue that the diffraction only happens going this way and going that way around the two surfaces. That the pattern's definitely generated not both directions, but in one decisive direction. And I suppose that's what I'm trying to say. If I shone light on the full rectangle of the slit, you would see a pattern go up and a pattern go down. Now, would it be logically sensible to think that the photon went down here and then shot up there, and that a photon came in here and shot down there? Or is the more sensible argument that these things are going around the edges, not that way? I think there's reason to think that there's some likelihood, it might be more probable, to say it in a weak sense, that it is bending around, not shooting in the opposite direction. All right, and that all you're really doing to create the pattern is multiplying the number of times the angle is achieved, in the sense that no matter which way the energy comes into the electron, it's going to travel the same path because of the field it's in. Generally speaking, the same path. And that it might even get a little fuzzier at the edges, more scatter, but that the angles are compound angles, in the sense that if the photon hits 3 electrons, in the sense that it hits one, gets readmitted, hits one, gets readmitted, and those admissions are at an angle, that the angles can become compound. So you're going, 17 degrees, 17 more degrees, 17 more degrees, and then 17 more degrees. So then that's when a density argument might be relevant to whatever the material is made out of, might have some effect on how many potential electron impacts a photon could have. But this is not what I'm saying is the truth. I'm just saying this could be an explanation. I think it's more likely that there is just the one diffraction likely, and that it's the number of field lines that are dictating how many dots there are, and that the number of the field lines, and again, this is another thing where I have tried to explain that I'm not talking about a magnetic or electric field lines. I'm talking about the fact that electrons don't like each other. So do I have a piece of hard paper here? I thought I did. Oh, here's one. The argument I'm making is that electrons have a repulsion built into them that will automatically, well, I just drew it wrong, but that'll automatically have them balance as a crowd. So they will maintain a consistent distance. All these distances will be exactly the same between each electron. The repulsive nature of them is balanced. So when one moves to a new location and emits a photon, an empty location presumably, or jiggles, goes in and then goes back again, it's going based on where the field potential is the weakest, is where it's going to go. And so that field of magnetic repulsion is the tension, and that tension is what causes the photon to enter and then get readmitted, because the tension won't allow for a full movement of the electron or something like that. It can only go halfway, and then it's pushed back to its location and emits the photon on the rebound. On the deceleration is when it releases the photon in the new direction. But the point is that these are the lines. So the lines would be representations of when I talk about lines between matter, the lines would be representations of the repulsive strength of electrons. So you could only have so many. They won't tolerate, as the slit gets narrower, the number of electrons that will be capable of sharing this space across starts diminishing. And so when the slit is getting narrow, there may only be 3 electrons across. In terms of that's all that's tolerable. They won't compact any closer together, so you'll just have to keep pushing them out the ends, in the sense that they will not fit in between the slits comfortably. And these are the lines of diffraction, essentially. The lines that you see reduces as you narrow the slit, because you're eliminating how many rows of electrons can exist within the opening. So they're not field lines in the sense of Maxwellian magnetism, because that's magnets aligning, that's dipoles lining. We're talking about monopoles aligning on their field lines. So the field lines for monopoles is different than the field lines for dipoles. Okay, so got that over with. All right. Let's see. Hypocrisy. There's a lot of that, of misunderstanding scientists. I think that's what I said. It's probably some other word, but it doesn't really matter. The most of his video is a rationalization or an excuse for, let's tell it in some kind of fabulistic story. So let's make up leprechauns to describe what Republicans are. See, Republicans are gold seekers and blah, 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 blah. And they're using this in some sort of metaphorical language, and they don't have to be specific. The double slit experiment is the foundation of quantum mechanics. It's the foundation of the wave-particle duality. It's, if any experiment is going to be taken seriously, and you really aren't allowed to make gross errors in your description, this should be the experiment. If any experiment is going to be honestly described, this should be the experiment. Now, I understand some experiments are too complicated because they have too many moving parts, so you have to accept the assumptions of the scientists. You can't scrutinize them unless you want to learn the details of, how the thickness of a glass on a mirror makes a difference because it slows the photon down. Learn all the fact that polarizing filters might destroy Bell's inequality as being useful, because there isn't an equality between how many frisbees get blocked going one way versus another way. More will get blocked going one way. More will get blocked, period. It's not a 50-50. And if you assume it's 50-50, you've made an error. Because some frisbees that go through don't go through because they hit the bars. I've used this point, but I'm just saying, people might assume that if I'm throwing frisbees at a jail cell, 50% won't, and I throw 50% sideways and 50% this way, that it'll be 50-50, and it won't. Only 45% will get through the bars. All right. So gravity. no, quality. Big picture does not have to be accurate. So again, he's saying, well, we're just using concepts and they don't have to be accurate. And these are just excuses for what I'm saying is complete misinformation about the strength of the evidence. So again, you can see it in gravitational lensing and all these other subjects. There's huge, it was proven, Edinburgh's experiment has proved it, and we find out that even he wouldn't have staked his life on it. He certainly wouldn't have staked the life of his children on it. He wasn't terribly confident that it was a great experiment done perfectly. And then you see the cosmological lensing images, and there's all kinds of flaws in the sense that the lens is way too big, the gravity can't be strong where the lens is, all kinds of, and there's no lenses where they should be, and voids in space where there's got to be gravitational bodies, but you see other things move around it, and yet there's no lensing. All right. And then you've brought up a lot of these other experiments that are based on radio waves and microwaves and different other kinds of radiation, and as is pointed out in some of the experiments themselves, they might be just experiencing scatter and diffraction because the waves are going through a highly energetic atmosphere around the gravitational body, like the sun. The sun has a huge density of particles around it. Those particles scatter certain kinds of radiation more than other kinds. So some of these experiments are intrinsically flawed because it has nothing to do with gravity. It has to do with the fact that the radio wave is traveling through a huge number of ions. Alright, anyway. Alright, so again, this is just, you're making excuses for the whole invisible man of science. Let's just create a bunch of mumbo jumbo and then claim there's no hidden variables because somebody hasn't found one. It's a horrible science, and I'm sorry that you think it's good enough that it's done this way. Let's see about the depth of the evidence, and that's what's really the misrepresentation has to do with the fact that they use these generalities to hide glaring insufficiencies in the depth of the evidence. The evidence is trivial and superficial, and yet they've just expanded on top of it as if it was a certain truth. And again, I'd use mock gravity as an example. If you're going to say that these are useful tools because they allow for some sort of fake running of a model so they can get somewhere with their model, I would argue that mock gravity does that, and yet no one's using mock gravity as an example of the truth. Nobody's doing lectures and nobody's teaching mock gravity in any public way or even in the more obtuse scientific lectures. It doesn't come up even in lectures at universities. They don't even talk about mock gravity. They might read a paragraph in a book somewhere, but they don't even talk about using it as a powerful tool when it does everything except work when you let the particle into the rest of the universe. If you confine the mechanism to the solar system or whatever thing you're studying, and you don't worry about inertia in space, velocity in space, mock gravity works perfectly. If you create your ultramundane particles, okay, and confine them in a bubble, they work just fine. But they don't use that. Why? Because that's a particle theory, and they're hostile. And that's just the truth. Let's see. Alright, the two slits is equal to the mass. So then you implied that the two slit idea and what they're talking about in terms of a Heisenberg or the particle splitting in two, you're implying that this isn't essential to the math, and it's essential to the math. The math won't work unless they split the particle in two. So let's not pretend the math isn't completely dependent on creating two waves, making one thing turn into two things. And it's essential to the math. So that's just bullshit. Let's see. So again, your whole idea that this is all demonstrated. Problem is not to see. I don't know what I was saying there. Pressure field. Okay, so Yeah, so you're saying that there's this big picture that leads to this idea of this multi-dimensional can only be the only way you can clean this up is with extra dimensions, and you're going and I'm going to argue that no, none of that is necessary. There's no extra dimensions, no time dimensions, no any of that, and all of it is solved by just giving the field energy its the due credit. The fact that gravity is a force and it does exist as a force. And that the force is expressed in these different forms, magnetism and photons, but it's all the active energy that's in the universe. So the active universe can explain all these phenomenon because it's not a dead universe. So it only looks like these other things have features because you're putting them in a dead field, a field of neutral, and it's not a neutral field, it's a pressure field, and you don't need extra dimensions if you just recognize. Like I said, ether didn't work because ether was a dead field. A dead field won't make the shit happen. An active field will make the shit happen. Alright. So again, just all this principles verified. And I'm arguing these are all assumptions based on what they think the mechanisms in these experiments are. You can clearly see that. Again, all these assumptions about what photons are capable of doing. No conversation at all about the material structure and the fact that there's every probability that the photon, that it matters where the photon goes. Close to this edge, that matters. Right dead through the middle, it matters. And that's what's affecting where the photon ends up, not some mushy Heisenberg wavy crap. And in hindsight, the very fact that I have to explain that there's an opening and photons do something different on the other side of the opening, and that what's different about what they do might have something to do with how close they are to a surface. In hindsight, it's going to look awful stupid that I had to actually say these words. That seems the probabilistic cause. Shit. Anyway, electrons are not consistent. Okay, so then he gets into an area that was just totally unnecessary, talking about the standard model and that there's some sort of extra photons. There's neutrinos and muons and whatever the other shitty element is, taus or something. Yeah, these are particles that don't exist. They're byproducts of action. So they're not in the static universe. There's no muons here in any kind of real number. They're degraded particles. They don't get this far through the atmosphere. They never last long enough. They're a byproduct of a collision. There's no collisions. So unless I have something, a furnace running right here, or some other active thing producing some sort of radiation, I don't have to count radiation. Okay, there's a little bit of background radiation. There are some elements of, there's ions and different kinds of atoms, but the real point is 99.9% of the electrons between me and this camera are standard electrons. They're not muons, they're not taus, they're not variants. They're standard, very reliably functioning electrons of the same atomic weight and very consistent and conservative physical mechanics. So no need for me to account for muons or taus in between the two slits. And no reason for me to do that at all. No scientific reason. Scientifically justified reason. Yeah, I think that's enough. I don't want to drag it out. I appreciate the conversation, but again, your conversation is always geared to some sort of attempt to take the edge off what are, I think, very poignant and accurate statements about the fact that the edifice of physics and quantum mechanics is a feeble foundation. It's built out of just a bunch of circumstantial creation of icons, creation of perfect people that make perfect calculations and perfect presumptions and assumptions. And again, when you scratch at it, not very hard, you see that there is no necessarily, it's not very perfect. And clearly, I'm not denying there's always going to be a relationship between photons and matter. So anytime there's matter, there's going to be electrons, and photons are going to hit the electrons. And there's always going to be a relationship between electrons and electrons. Electrons don't like each other, and they billiard ball off of each other. The force between them pushes them away from each other like magnets. And so if I shove two electrons into each other, like shoving two magnets into each other, they're going to push against each other. And this one's going to, so you can see it, that it's not necessarily going to push away, it's going to push up and down. It's going to do, they're going to do things because they don't like each other. And that's a truth. And that truth is consistent. But that doesn't have anything to do with a wave theory. There's absolutely no need to create a wave theory to explain why when you bang two things into each other in free space that they're going to twist or turn or move in a certain direction based on the field that's controlling them. They'll have an option to go certain ways based on the field pressure around them. And some paths are you know, if I have another magnet, so I have these two magnets and I put a third magnet here, the choice that this magnet, let me try it the right way, the choice that, well, yeah, okay, the choice that this thing's going to have isn't going to be forward. It's definitely going to be that way. All right? That's the mechanics. That doesn't have anything to do with a wave theory. And it certainly is probabilistic, though, in terms of we can figure out what the probability is of that matrix being complete or incomplete, and how many voids or how many places there are for the electron to go, and whether it can go somewhere or whether it has to push them all forward. Like a transparency might just be that everything is arranged so tightly that there's no choice but forward motion, so there's no choice but for the photon to be accurately represented at the other end of the material, because all of the movement of the electrons is confined to a narrow road. It can't travel sideways. It can't do perpendiculars. And so it maintains its character at the other end. Where in regular matter, I mean opaque matter, that breaks down in the sense the electrons can go left and right, and the movement of the electrons can just generate heat and release infrared radiation. Clearly we can argue that there's a complexity of that mechanical arrangement when we see that a simple element like helium, you know, going back to the diffraction grating, you know, you can look at the signature of helium when it's burned, and you'll see certain lines that are very sharp, meaning that certain photons, certain packets of energy are released when you jiggle the hydrogen atom. So when you force it out of its relaxed condition, you know, with an extra bolt, it goes back to the relaxed. And every time you force it out, you break the bonds. The bonds of field energy is released, and they have a consistent signature because there's a consistent relationship holding them together. Consistent amounts of field energy based on distances. And those are the signature photons created. So we know there's a relationship, but we also know from the consistency of that pattern that the geometry is consistent, and you can shake it all day long and it's always going to give you those proportions, because that's the field holding that atom together. And it's all about these fields. Everything is force, and we're just force segregated, polarized. And it's very specific very specific packets of polarization forced by the pressure of their gradient into positions. And again, the standard model has very little to do with a practical nuclear model, because the nuclear model really is just made of these constituent elements, the three forces, the magneton, the graviton, the photon, and the electron, the proton, and the neutron. And I think with those elements you can explain 90% of the function within the universe. Anyway, So enough of a video. Yeah, this is just going to be tedious. I can just see all the way down. It's going to be just this constant battle of where you're not going to properly recognize the fact that I have found a way to unify all the forces, explain the conservation of all momentum, the idea that acceleration and velocity are all made of these fish, so to speak, this energy that is collected in packets of color, blue, red, plus, minus, and that having plusness or minusness means something in terms of how you interact with the other bits. I mean, I just frankly find this you're knocking me down with these trivial pursuits of you know, trivial factoids, when I think I have done my job in the sense of giving good reason to doubt standard physics, and that's all I want you to do, is to have good reason to doubt it. It is kind of a religion, lots of made-up elements, lots of assumptions based on trivial evidence, and now your brain is free to say, okay, let's re-look at it and say, what's a better explanation? Heisenberg, or the fact that you can't look at a force. You can't see force. There's no thing to interact with a force except something much bigger than it. There's no way to see it because there's no light you can bounce off of it that's smaller than it. Force is the smallest element. You'll never see one. You'll never be able to measure one without having it collide into something much bigger. And that's just a truth. It would be true of meteors. If the only way you could know a meteor was to see when it hit you where it came from, you know, that's all you have. There's no other way to tell before the meteor hits you where the meteor is if all you have is an Earth to detect it with. If all I can do is detect it with an Earth by putting an Earth somewhere and have the meteor hit it, then of course I could never see a meteor. And that's the same circumstance we're in. We're in the circumstance where the only tool we have is an electron. That's the smallest thing we can see a photon with. There's no other seer, there's no other eyeball to use but an electron. An electron is the difference between an Earth and a meteor. That's the proportional real difference. How can I see it with an Earth? I can't. And it's even more dramatic than that in the sense that you can't rub up against a photon, you can't do any of this. You have to let it hit you to see where it moves you. There's no, the meteor goes through the Earth's atmosphere and tugs it, because that's not going to happen in nuclear physics. Because it's kinetic. There's no force under the force. See, this is another way of knowing it doesn't go all the way down, is you can kind of know that photons can't just fiddle with Earths. They can't drag an electron along. They can't subtly influence it. The influence is all or nothing, and that kind of indicates that there's no force smaller than the photon. The meteors are the smallest bits, so there's no gravity to pull them into things and all that kind of stuff. That ain't happening. There's only that force. So there's no way to subtly look at a meteor. You either catch it and see where it pushes you, or you do nothing. And that's the position we're in with all elements of force. We'll never see a graviton, we'll never see a magneton, and we'll never see a photon. We'll never know position and direction at the same exact time without it hitting us. Alright, enough of an argument, I believe. Oh, let's play some of this. Yeah, I didn't finish it. Yeah, I knew there was something else I wanted to do.
An explanation of everything else. The quantum mechanical beliefs fit everything else.
Okay, see, so they just keep, yeah, I don't agree with it fitting. Okay, I've pointed out where they can't even properly do the math for the double slit experiment. They don't have math that does the pattern correctly. So you're saying it does everything. It does everything. It doesn't even explain this. It doesn't. So fuck this bullshit. of telling me that it's perfect and it's done everything, it's predicted everything. It's a fucking on-off pattern, for fuck's sake. If you want to think of it as sine wave, it's a fucking sine wave, for fuck's sake. The simplest wave possible. And you're telling me this predicts everything in the universe. No, it doesn't. And again, I'm not saying there aren't probabilistic rules of interaction between meteors and Earths. There are rules. But they're knowable rules. They don't require any randomness or Heisenberg bullshit.
So, to claim to have a better theory is to also have something which fits everything else.
Right. Well, I've already pointed out that my theory fits everything else in the sense that your theory doesn't unify. Quantum mechanics doesn't unify gravity and the nuclear forces, where my theory recognizes that all force is nuclear. All gravity. Gravity isn't affecting the big body. Gravity is affecting my protons and electrons. Gravity is moving them, and I'm going with them, so to speak. Okay, all the forces are affecting the nuclear bits. The entire universe is taking place in the nuclear level. It's not taking place in this big level. There is no big level. There's just the nuclear bits, for fuck's sake.
Mendeley talks about just gravity and magnetic electric type forces, as though he doesn't have to explain the nuclear force.
Again, there are no nuclear force. The nuclear force is the red and the blue. The nuclear force is plus charge and minus charge. It's the same exact force. So it's just proximity. Okay, obviously in tight proximity, the force is very strong. You can never get that kind of proximity in a physical magnet we can create in our world. We can't feel, we can't know the strength of that force on the nuclear level. Again, it's a nuclear force. But it's the same damn one. It's just the expression of it irradiated in this big atmosphere. It's a huge dilution of the force because we've R-squared that force to pieces. The real origin of the source is these little tiny bits inside of atoms. And obviously by the time it gets to me, that force has been R-squared into a minimum force when it's a very powerful force at the nucleus.
But what the hell keeps all those protons in such proximity to each other?
Well, obviously that's a structure and the neutrons are critical to that. So if I argue the neutrons are really dipoles, then you can come up with some sort of explanation how the neutrons are creating a supplementary space in the sense that the neutrons are connecting the protons plus minus plus minus plus minus, if you get my drift. And so there's the repulsive force of the protons is being overwhelmed by the